Tom always believed life's most profound revelations happened when you least expected them, like realizing your brand new trailer had become a fiery inferno at exactly 3:13 a.m. on a Wednesday. Standing barefoot in his driveway, garden hose in hand and boxer shorts flapping gently in the midnight breeze, Tom wondered vaguely if perhaps moving into Sunny Estates was karmic punishment for all the petty crimes of his childhood. Flames crackled merrily from the now blackened storage trailer, lighting up the otherwise peaceful street like an overly enthusiastic 4th of July barbecue. Barely awake, adrenaline coursing through his veins, Tom glanced up to find his neighbor and reigning HOA president, Karen Hartwell, staring from the sidewalk with a horror-stricken yet oddly satisfied expression. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the smoke-filled chaos, Karen's jaw dropping theatrically as if she had never expected flames to actually emerge from the burning propane tanks she'd accidentally knocked over. Tom's suspicion hardened into certainty. The woman who just yesterday handed him a pink notice for violating Article 12A trailer aesthetics had set his trailer ablaze. "Do you need me to call someone?" Karen shouted, her voice shrill yet artificially concerned, clutching her pink fleece robe dramatically closed. Her perfectly manicured fingers hovered indecisively over her phone, as if choosing between dialing emergency services or updating her social media profile about the neighborhood excitement. "Oh gosh, Tom, this is really just awful. I did warn you about parking that eyesore here." Tom's eyes narrowed, the cool jet of water from the hose seeming ridiculously inadequate against the engulfing flames. The absurdity of Karen's statement, delivered without a shred of irony, would have been hilarious if not for the fact that his livelihood was currently turning into charcoal before his eyes. "You did warn me, Karen," Tom shouted back, choking slightly on smoke, "but I missed the part where setting my property on fire was the standard HOA procedure." Karen flushed red, clearly flustered. "Well, of course, I didn't set it on fire intentionally. I merely attempted to relocate some dangerous propane tanks," she stammered, momentarily losing control of her carefully rehearsed narrative. "Public safety is our #1 priority at Sunny Estates." Tom turned, spraying water aimlessly into the flames, the fire roaring defiantly louder as if mocking his efforts. "Really? Because right now, Karen, your top priority looks like property destruction with a dash of attempted murder." At that moment, Karen's husband, Gerald, an aging accountant with a permanent look of exhaustion etched onto his face, appeared sleepily on the sidewalk. Wearing a pair of striped pajamas and clutching a half-eaten muffin, he stared blankly at the chaotic scene unfolding before him. "Honey, are we committing felonies again?" he asked Karen dryly, taking another apathetic bite. "Because I distinctly remember our therapist telling us to stop doing that." Karen shot her husband a withering glance, embarrassment morphing into righteous indignation. "Gerald, I told you to stay inside. This is an HOA emergency," she hissed, tugging her robe tighter as neighbors began emerging from their homes, some recording the chaos on their phones while others merely watched in stunned amusement. Tom briefly wondered if there was something in the Sunny Estates water supply that stripped neighbors of common sense. His disbelief only intensified as his trailer, finally conceding defeat, gave one final, dramatic burst of flame before collapsing spectacularly, sending a column of sparks skyward. A distant neighbor shouted sarcastically, "Looks like we finally found the cause of declining property values." By the time the fire department arrived, Tom was drenched, exhausted, and entertaining several creative fantasies about how Karen might spontaneously combust. He wrapped himself in a borrowed blanket as firefighters extinguished what remained of his trailer, leaving behind a smoldering heap of melted aluminum, twisted tools, and dreams deferred. "You'll have to forgive Karen," Gerald murmured, sidling over beside Tom. "She's been really touchy since losing the HOA election at our old neighborhood. Apparently, ordering people around and enforcing meaningless rules are her way of dealing with unresolved emotional trauma." Tom gave Gerald a long, sideways glance. Well, setting trailers on fire is an innovative coping mechanism, I'll give her that, he muttered, brushing ash from his shoulder. Any chance she's got insurance for causing emotional trauma to others? Gerald chuckled dryly, eyes staring blankly into the smoldering wreckage. Not yet, but I'll mention it to her therapist. As dawn slowly crept over sunny estates, Tom's frustration crystallized into quiet determination. If Karen wanted a battle, she just ignited one, literally. Tom wasn't a confrontational man by nature. He preferred fixing electrical panels to starting neighborhood wars. But something about watching his trailer reduced to rubble had lit a fire within him that wouldn't easily be extinguished. Hours later, after the firefighters had left and the curious neighbors drifted homeward, Tom stood quietly alone, holding the cleanup invoice he'd just received. Anger simmered beneath his typically relaxed exterior. That trailer had been more than just equipment storage. It symbolized a fresh start after his divorce, independence, and the optimism of a simpler life. And Karen, with her self-appointed title of suburban dictator, had turned it into scrap metal. Carefully folding the bill, he slid it into a large, crisp envelope, neatly addressing it not just to Karen but to every member of the Sunny Estates HOA board. He paused, pen hovering above the address line. Perhaps he'd gone too far. Perhaps he'd overlooked some obscure HOA rule prohibiting residents from billing the board for felony arson. But recalling Karen's smug face framed by flames was enough to settle any doubts. With a mischievous smile, Tom dropped the envelope into the mailbox, savoring the satisfying thunk as it disappeared inside. Sunny Estates was about to discover that you didn't burn an electrician's livelihood without risking getting shocked right back. 2 days after the fiery spectacle in Tom's driveway, the Sunny Estates Community Center filled with anxious chatter and heated whispers. Tom arrived 10 minutes early, hoping to claim a seat far enough from Karen's piercing glare but close enough to effectively deliver his accusation. Unfortunately, arriving early hadn't paid off. Karen, in her carefully ironed blouse and pearl necklace, was already positioned at the front table, flanked by fellow board members who wore expressions ranging from vague confusion to outright amusement. Tom found an empty seat between Ravi, the tech-savvy software engineer who seemed perpetually annoyed with life in Sunny Estates, and Frank, a retired military veteran whose steely gaze suggested he'd survived far worse battles than those waged in suburban neighborhoods. Frank nodded curtly toward Tom, then leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Son, I've seen war zones less hostile than this HOA. You picked quite the fight," he muttered, a gleam of approval flickering briefly in his eyes. Before Tom could reply, Karen stood abruptly, tapping a silver pen against a clipboard as if conducting an orchestra of chaos. "All right, everyone, let's begin," she announced with exaggerated authority. "We have urgent community business. As you may know, resident Tom Bennett violated HOA code by parking a dangerously unattractive trailer in full view of our delicate community aesthetic." Ravi snorted audibly beside Tom, rolling his eyes. "Dangerously unattractive? Has she ever actually looked in a mirror?" He whispered loud enough for Tom and several others nearby to hear clearly. Debbie, the cheerful gardener seated behind them, laughed openly before quickly covering her mouth in embarrassment. Karen narrowed her eyes at Ravi briefly but continued without pause. Furthermore, due to unforeseen circumstances, she cleared her throat, dramatically avoiding eye contact with Tom. The said trailer suffered damage and required community-funded emergency cleanup, the cost of which Mr. Bennett has, rather arrogantly, submitted directly to our HOA board. A ripple of amusement and whispers spread across the room. Tom rose from his seat, calmly holding up a copy of the invoice. "Karen, let's clarify unforeseen circumstances," he said smoothly, ignoring the sudden tension thickening around them. "You set my trailer on fire, an act I'd consider somewhat intentional. I've even got video evidence proving it." A shocked gasp echoed through the audience as Karen visibly paled, gripping her clipboard tighter. "That's preposterous," she snapped. I was merely protecting Sunny Estates from hazardous propane storage violations. And besides, she added defensively, no one can hold the HOA liable for necessary community safety actions. Community safety? Tom repeated incredulously. The only danger my trailer posed was to your personal sense of decor. But you're right about liability. I don't hold the entire HOA responsible, only the board members who've allowed this authoritarian circus to continue. Applause broke out spontaneously, surprising both Tom and Karen, who turned beet red. Frank slapped Tom's shoulder approvingly, murmuring, "Now that's what I call a tactical maneuver, son." Karen, flustered but regaining her composure, tapped her pen rapidly. "Enough theatrics. If anyone has something relevant to add, please speak clearly." Debbie immediately jumped up, brushing dirt from her gardening apron. "Since we're airing grievances, maybe we could talk about Karen fining me for planting overly cheerful flowers," she announced sarcastically, eliciting laughter from the room. "Apparently, happiness is against Sunny Estates guidelines." Frank stood slowly, straightening to his full imposing height. "And don't forget how Karen cited me for flying the American flag 2 inches too large," he growled, eyes fixed sharply on Karen. "Nothing says patriotism like measuring flags with a ruler." Karen's composure cracked further, desperation showing in her forced smile. "Those infractions were clearly outlined in the community handbook." Ravi interrupted, standing dramatically. "Oh, you mean the handbook no one can interpret without a law degree?" He turned theatrically toward the gathered crowd. "Did you all know Karen once fined me because my Diwali decorations glowed offensively bright? She said it disrupted community harmony." Laughter and sympathetic murmurs filled the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably beside Karen, clearly reconsidering their alliance. Feeling emboldened, Tom stepped forward again. "It seems Sunny Estates has more problems than just my burned trailer. Perhaps the real issue isn't aesthetics, but our leadership." Karen slammed her clipboard down, panic replaced with anger. "If you think removing me will magically transform Sunny Estates into some lawless utopia, you're mistaken. There will always be rules." "No one's asking for chaos," Tom countered smoothly, "just rational, humane decisions, like not committing arson over a minor violation." Suddenly, the room fell silent as Gerald, Karen's weary husband, raised his hand from the back row. Every head turned simultaneously, watching curiously as he cleared his throat, standing reluctantly. "Folks, I'm not proud of admitting this, but Karen does tend to overreact occasionally," he began softly, choosing his words carefully. "As her husband, I must suggest the board at least reconsider the fine levied against Tom." Karen's eyes widened dramatically in betrayal. "Gerald, how dare you?" Ignoring her protest, Gerald continued calmly, "She hasn't exactly been the same since losing the HOA presidency at our previous neighborhood. Maybe we've all let this go too far." The murmurs turned sympathetic, neighbors nodding thoughtfully. Karen appeared genuinely shaken, struggling to respond. Tom seized the momentum again, holding his evidence higher. "This isn't just about me. It's about Sunny Estates, and whether we want fairness or tyranny." The community center erupted in loud agreement, Karen staring desperately around the room, grasping for any ally. Finally, defeated, she dropped heavily into her chair, clipboard slipping unnoticed from her fingers. She looked up, exhausted yet still defiant, managing a final scathing glare toward Tom. "Enjoy your victory tonight, Tom," she whispered bitterly, loud enough only for those closest to hear clearly. "But believe me, you'll regret turning this community against me." Tom met her eyes without wavering. "No, Karen. You've done that perfectly yourself." As residents dispersed slowly into the night, Frank, Debbie, and Ravi clustered around Tom, their earlier animosity now replaced by camaraderie. Frank shook Tom's hand firmly, grinning. "Welcome to suburban warfare, son. Hope you're ready." Tom laughed lightly, glancing back at Karen's rapidly retreating figure. "Ready or not," he replied, The battle has officially begun. Tom had always assumed suburban life would be quiet, predictable, even dull. But ever since Karen had reduced his storage trailer to smoldering rubble, life in sunny estates had evolved into something closer to a spy thriller than the idyllic retirement community he'd envisioned. 1 week after the chaotic HOA meeting, he found himself seated around Ravi's sleek dining table, laptops open, surrounded by Frank, Debbie, and an impressive assortment of snacks that Debbie insisted were essential for covert operations. Ravi's fingers danced quickly across his keyboard, his eyes squinting with concentration as cryptic lines of code flew across his screen. "You know," Ravi murmured distractedly, "I always imagined my hacking skills would be used for something glamorous, like infiltrating the Pentagon, not investigating Karen's shady HOA expenses." Frank grunted, carefully examining a clipboard full of invoices they'd retrieved from the HOA office dumpster that afternoon. "War isn't always glamorous, Ravi. But every good war requires solid intel," he said firmly. "If we're gonna beat Karen, we need proof she's misusing HOA funds, not just hearsay and angry accusations." Debbie popped a grape into her mouth, nodding enthusiastically. "Exactly. Also, when this ends up as a Netflix series, I'd like it noted that I was instrumental in providing delicious snacks and moral support." Tom laughed softly, grateful that he'd somehow attracted this quirky, loyal group of allies. Ravi suddenly sat upright, eyes wide in surprise, fingers frozen mid-type. "Got something," he announced triumphantly. "It seems our esteemed president, Karen Hartwell, has been quite creative with HOA finances. She spent $3,000 last year on something labeled Aesthetic Community Enhancement. But guess where the money really went?" Frank leaned forward eagerly, squinting at the screen. "Please tell me it was something scandalous." Ravi smiled mischievously. "She spent it at Eternal Youth Spa and Salon. It appears Karen's manicures and monthly spa treatments are officially classified as community beautification projects." Tom felt vindicated, excitement and disbelief warring within him. "That's outright embezzlement. She lectures us about aesthetics while charging manicures to HOA funds." Debbie laughed, shaking her head. "Well, at least she keeps herself well manicured while torching residents' property. Priorities, you know." Frank raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Great work, Ravi. Now we've got ammunition. But we need to keep digging. If she's comfortable charging spa visits, there might be even bigger skeletons hiding in her closet." Tom nodded thoughtfully, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe we should confront Karen privately first. Give her a chance to step down quietly before we expose her publicly." Frank frowned skeptically. "Son, I admire your optimism, but I've never known a tyrant who stepped down willingly. Still, a private confrontation could rattle her enough to make mistakes." Later that evening, as Tom was cleaning up the remnants of their covert operation, empty snack bowls and soda cans, he was startled by a sharp knock at his front door. Opening it cautiously, he found himself face to face with Gerald Hartwell, Karen's perpetually weary husband. Gerald stood awkwardly on the porch, nervously adjusting his glasses as though unsure how he'd arrived at this particular moment in his life. "Gerald," Tom began cautiously, "is everything okay?" Gerald hesitated before sighing deeply. "Tom, I came here without Karen knowing. Can we talk?" Tom invited him inside, watching curiously as Gerald took a seat, shoulders slumped with resignation. "Look, I'm not here to justify what Karen did. Actually, I'm embarrassed by her behavior. But maybe it'll help you understand why she's acting like this." Tom waited silently, intrigued. Gerald continued slowly, visibly uncomfortable. "Karen wasn't always like this. In our last neighborhood, she ran for HOA president and lost badly. She took the defeat personally, convinced everyone hated her. Moving here was supposed to be a fresh start, but instead, she became obsessed, determined never to be humiliated again." Tom sighed sympathetically. "I appreciate you sharing that, Gerald, but it doesn't excuse what she's done. I know, Gerald agreed quietly, but maybe it explains why she's spiraling. She doesn't know how to stop herself. It's exhausting for me, for her, and obviously for the neighborhood. I hoped you'd consider not escalating things further. Tom frowned thoughtfully, weighing Gerald's words carefully. Believe me, Gerald, I don't want things to escalate. But your wife literally set my property on fire. And we just discovered she's misappropriating HOA funds for personal expenses. Gerald looked genuinely startled. Wait, Karen did what? Tom outlined Ravi's findings, watching Gerald's eyes widen in shock and dismay. When Tom finished, Gerald slumped further into the sofa, defeated. I knew she was becoming difficult, but this goes beyond difficult. It's criminal. Tom softened his voice gently. Gerald, maybe you should talk to her. Convince her to step down voluntarily before we take this evidence to the community. Gerald nodded slowly, visibly shaken. I'll try, Tom. I can't promise she'll listen, but I'll definitely try. After Gerald left, Tom sat quietly in his living room, realizing just how complicated things had become. This wasn't merely about revenge or vindication anymore. It involved genuine human tragedy hidden beneath suburban absurdity. But just as he began contemplating a peaceful resolution, his phone buzzed sharply. Picking it up, Tom saw Ravi's panic text. Tom, emergency! Someone broke into my house and stole my laptop. Only took the one with evidence against Karen. Tom's pulse quickened as he stared at the message, instantly realizing the implications. Karen wasn't backing down quietly. She was escalating their suburban war dramatically. Feeling both outrage and admiration at Karen's tenacity, Tom realized she was prepared to go much further than he'd imagined. A fierce determination surged through him. If Karen wanted war, he'd match her tactics, but smarter, stronger, and fairer. After all, she'd taught him that suburban conflicts weren't just petty squabbles. They were battles fought in the trenches of manicured lawns and driveways. And Tom wasn't going to back down, not when justice was finally within reach. The sky over Sunny Estates was unusually gray that afternoon, as if even the weather had decided to lean into the drama. Tom stood near the front of the community center, watching residents filter in with the cautious excitement of people attending a trial they never thought they'd be invited to. Word had spread fast. Ravi's laptop theft, instead of silencing them, had only ignited further curiosity. Rumors that Karen had orchestrated the break-in were now swirling like leaves in a storm, and the residents of Sunny Estates were ready for answers. Tom glanced at his phone one last time, double-checking that the new evidence was backed up on 3 separate devices. After Ravi's incident, Frank had insisted on going full Cold War protocol. Encrypted files, offline storage, even a USB drive hidden inside an empty can of whipped cream in Tom's fridge. Karen might have thought she'd pulled the plug on their plans, but all she did was raise the stakes. Inside the center, the boards sat in their usual spots, their expressions a mixture of anxiety, curiosity, and mild terror. Karen, however, looked different. Her usual mask of confidence had slipped, just slightly. The pearls were still there, but they hung around her neck like a chain now. Her eyes scanned the room rapidly, calculating, her posture a little less rigid than usual. Gerald sat 2 rows back, arms crossed, not even pretending to smile. Frank called the meeting to order, standing at the podium with the kind of commanding presence that made everyone instinctively sit up straighter. Today, we are here to address multiple community concerns, he began. Chief among them, the ongoing allegations against our HOA president, Karen Hartwell. There was no applause, no cheering. Just a heavy, electric silence as every eye turned to Karen. She forced a polite smile and stood. Thank you, Frank. I'd like to clarify that these so-called allegations are being stirred up by a few residents with personal vendettas. We must be careful not to let paranoia and conspiracy theories destroy the harmony we've worked so hard to build. Tom took a slow breath, then walked up to the front with a flash drive in hand. Without waiting for permission, He plugged it into the community projector and clicked to the first slide. Karen froze. The room darkened slightly as the screen lit up. The first image showed a clearly itemized expense report listing Eternal Youth Spa under Community Beautification. Laughter bubbled up in a few corners of the room. Tom didn't smile. "This is just the beginning," Tom said calmly. "We've gone through every record from the last 2 years. Karen has spent over $14,000 in HOA funds on personal services, non-existent consulting fees, and unauthorized landscaping for her own backyard, all disguised as community improvements." He clicked through more slides, copies of receipts, dates, vendor names, and notes Karen had written to herself, including one particularly damning comment: "Disguise as general garden maintenance." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Someone muttered, "She really wrote that down?" Karen tried to recover, stepping forward with a trembling smile. "Those records are being taken completely out of context. I was following board-approved budgets." "Really?" Debbie stood now, holding up her own copy of the budget. "Because the board never approved any of these. And I think it's pretty telling that every single contractor she hired just happens to be a close friend or relative." Ravi rose next, adding fuel to the fire. "Also, we traced the security camera footage from my home. The night my laptop was stolen, guess whose car was seen circling my block at 1 a.m.? Karen's. And if anyone's curious, the footage is backed up on 4 different platforms." Karen turned a deep shade of red, her voice shrill now. "You people are insane. This is a witch hunt." "No, Karen," Frank said sternly, stepping beside Tom now. "This is accountability." The board members whispered furiously among themselves before one finally stood, Cynthia, the treasurer. She cleared her throat, looking down at a printout she'd been clutching. "Given the mounting evidence, and in the interest of restoring trust to this community, I motion for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president." Tom stepped back, surprised by the speed of the unraveling. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Residents began raising their hands. One by one, almost every single hand in the room went up. The final count left no ambiguity. Karen was officially removed. The silence that followed was strangely heavy. Tom expected cheers or at least a sigh of relief, but what he saw instead was something more complicated. People processing the fact that the fear they'd lived under for years had finally lifted. It was liberation, yes, but also a shared realization that they'd all allowed it to go on too long. Karen stood still, visibly shaken. Then, for the first time since Tom had moved in, she looked genuinely vulnerable. Her voice, when it came, was soft and trembling. "I just wanted to make this place better. I didn't know how to stop once it started. I thought, if I wasn't in control, I'd disappear." Nobody responded at first. Then Gerald stood up, walked slowly to her side, and said quietly, "You never needed control. You just needed to listen." He gently took her arm and led her out of the room. No one stopped them. Later, as the meeting wound down and neighbors milled about, chatting more freely than Tom had ever seen them, Cynthia approached him with a smile. "You did this, you know. You brought people together. The board wants to offer you the interim presidency until we can hold proper elections." Tom blinked, half laughing. "Me? Oh no. I just wanted my trailer and a little piece." Debbie clapped him on the back. "Exactly. Which is why you're perfect for the job." Frank grinned. "Besides, we'll help you. Ravi's already redesigning the HOA website to include a ridiculous rule of the month feature." Ravi raised a soda in salute. "Democracy with memes. It's the future." Tom hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "All right. But only if we start by officially banning any HOA-related arson." Everyone laughed, and for the first time, it didn't feel strained or nervous. It felt like a neighborhood. A real one. The next morning, Tom found a box sitting on his porch. Inside was a brand new fire extinguisher with a handwritten note. "For future HOA disagreements, use this instead." from your grateful neighbors." Tom laughed out loud, shaking his head. Sunny Estates would never be perfect, but it was finally, for the first time, his home.